Greetings! As you can see, I'm not in my usual goblin dungeon. I'm actually in a hotel in Manila, Philippines for the last Infinity DLC of this Lorcana season, I think as a whole across the world and also in Asia. It's day 2 of the Infinity DLC in Manila. I'm in my hotel room, so obviously it didn't go very well for me. I finished 4-3 by round 5. I was out of contention for day 2. Quick recap, I was playing Sapphire Steel. This is the janky ass list I was playing. The idea was that it would be pretty good into any version of Ruby Sapphire, very good into Emerald Amethyst Diablo, so into Dogs, and pretty bad against Steel Song. And unfortunately, in rounds 1, 2, and 5, I paired Steel Song. Those were my 3 losses. I was out. Hey, it is what it is. In any event, I still had a blast. It was fun to travel to yet another DLC. It's my 3rd of this season. In Asia. But what I want to talk about in this video is to be basically a send-off, a farewell show to the first Infinity season that we've had in Lorcana. With Attack of the Vine almost upon us and we're moving towards a rotation for new core from sets 9 to 13, seemed like a good place to talk about what happened in the past 2 to 3 months with Infinity and eventually evaluate whether this format was ultimately a success for the game of Lorcana or not. First, to recap a brief history of the Infinity format. On 6th of May 2025, Ravensburger did a stream announcing the next chapter for Lorcana, where they announced rotation with the incoming set Fabled, and the launch of a new format, Infinity, where cards that had been rotated out of Core Constructed would still be playable. At the time, people were actually more concerned with rotation in Core. Bulk of the controversy and conversation was saying that rotation is an absolute disaster. They shouldn't follow the model of Magic the Gathering. Cards would devalue, players would leave, so on and so forth. And so therefore, there was not much fanfare for Infinity. I think the decision ultimately to have an Infinity format is logical. Maybe biased because I come from a Magic background. But to understand the reason why it makes sense, we first have to talk about the reason to have rotation in Core Constructed. In the long run, if we talk about this game over the next 5 to 10 years, having rotation every year keeps the main competitive format of Lorcana fresh. It allows design mistakes in cards to rotate out after 1 or 2 years. Perhaps not a single card because that's bannable, but perhaps an entire mechanics too busted, for example. Where any power outliers will eventually leave, it gives the Ravensburger design team more room to innovate, to make different color pairs more viable, to allow different mechanics to take center stage, which ultimately leads to selling more packs, right? So that's good for the game. But if we were to do a rotation in Core Constructed, we need a place for players to play with their cards that have since rotated out, because as a value proposition, it's not generally great for players to want to buy into packs or cards that are only good for 2 years. They need to have a place to play the cards that have left, and so therefore we need a format to have that, therefore Infinity. Logical. But was this Infinity format just something they were putting lip service to? Were they actually going to support it? It was not until 27 June 2025, during the Disney World Championships for that year, where they showed us where Infinity would go. They announced that in both North America and Europe, they would be getting one Infinity DLC as their 3rd and last DLC, both of which will be in June 2026. And then we also later learned that DLC Manila, which I am now at, or I guess not at, in July, would also be Infinity. So there we have it. This format has a competitive purpose in a window in a competitive season between June and July of this year. But unfortunately, from June 2025 onwards, there was not much fanfare or discussion about Infinity because the focus was on Core Constructed. There was not a lot of grassroots supports given to the shops to run Infinity events alongside Core Constructed. Apart from, side events at DLCs, and also the one-off Infinity weekend that happened in, I think, December 2025, where they gave the whole new world as a promo, which, by the way, people also complained about, oh, why are we doing an Infinity weekend event when we're in the middle of the Core Constructor season and the next DLC is 2 weeks away? Free stuff, trying to push another format. Lorcana players just want to complain about everything. But the Infinity weekend, I think, ultimately was a success in some places, wasn't a success in a lot of places where I saw they were just giving out a whole new world promos to people who showed up because nobody wanted to play it. But it still at least brought the format to the attention of the wider player base who may have only joined during Fable. Thereafter, the last big piece of news we heard for Infinity before all the DLCs in June, July 2026 would take place was the banning of Hiram Flaversham. On 26 March 2026, a ban announcement was made that Hiram Flaversham would be banned in the Infinity format. As I had discussed in a prior video already, this was a banning that the format desperately needed prior to the release of Wilds Unknown. So that's all the context we need. Now let's try and evaluate properly whether this Infinity season, the first go at it, was a success or a failure. So the first metric I want to look at is in general play popularity. And of course, I don't really have statistics and numbers here from every shop, but I think anecdotally and from my own experience in Asia, specifically Singapore, I think that the general popularity of Infinity amongst the casual fan base is still remains quite low, even after this Infinity season. Casual play at shops is already on the decline for core constructed, depending on what area or region or country you're in. And adding in Infinity, where a lot of the new players who joined the game during the worldwide launch of Fabled, they wouldn't have access to the old cards. They don't have interest in buying the old cards just to play, for 2 months of this season. It just didn't really take off at a casual local level. But if we look at the popularity in the premier level events, in the DLCs that took place, and here on screen, I'll put up the numbers for by region. So the DLCs in America versus the DLCs in Europe. And if we were to look at the numbers for core constructed versus numbers for Infinity, we can see that there is a market drop-off in participation, but the numbers that turned up for the Infinity DLCs is still fairly respectable, right? So amongst the most engaged players who are there to want to be competitive, who want to, get the golden Mickeys, who want to qualify for their regional championships and world championships, they don't mind playing Infinity, but they do mind it more enough to not show up to the same level as they would to core constructed events. But for a first attempt at this format where there is a bit of a card availability issue because the set 1 to set 8 prints were clearly not as widespread as from Fable onwards, it's still pretty good, I would say. If we were to just quickly look at online play, unofficial online play across this Infinity season, we can see that when we compare to the core constructed numbers for Wilds Unknown core constructed, the numbers are less, substantially less, but still a respectable amount, probably propped up by the people who were practicing for their participation in the aforesaid Infinity DLCs. There's still a lot of room for this format to grow because and it's not like we have to grow the game, right? We just have to grow this format amongst the already enfranchised players in the game. People who only play core constructed can be captured to also join the Infinity space. And I think that for the players who join at Fabled, once the cards in set 5 to set 8 rotate out, then they may be more engaged and be more interested in playing with these cards in Infinity. So not the greatest start, but a respectable one, and where we can see that there may be an upward trajectory for the format to grow. Alright, next up, let's talk about metagame variety. So personally, I really enjoy the metagame variety in Infinity. I think it's better than core constructed, but let's leave aside my preferences first. Let's first look at some hard numbers, right? So let's compare the day 1 Friday of DLC Ghent, which was core constructed, versus DLC Dortmund day 1 on Saturday. And if you look at them, they look kind of similar, the figures, but what we can glean is that the top deck in terms of representation is slightly less represented. And in terms of just play popularity, there's enough space, it looks like, in Infinity for big 4 popular decks, whereas in core constructed, it looks like, at least in the past format, there's only space for like 3 decks, right? So of course, Infinity is going to last like eternally. So comparing it to a single core constructed format is not the best, because we ideally should compare it against every single core constructed format that happened before to truly say that there's more deck variety. But I think most people watching this would agree with me that there is more deck variety in Infinity compared to core constructed, and that's largely down to the larger card pool. With a larger card pool, you have access to more powerful cards across all ink color combinations, which allow you to at least do something that's competitive in most, if not all, of the ink color combinations. Even within a single ink color combination, like say Ruby Sapphire, we have in Infinity 3 different or at least 2.5 different viable decks. We have Ruby, Sapphire, Shark that plays a bunch of actions and Olaf, and we also have Ruby Sapphire items that does the Maurice's Workshop thing. And the half is kind of like the Sadler Ruby Sapphire super actions that goes for like Lilo and a lot of actions to churn out fast Olafs and let it goes and stuff. Overall, I think that because of the larger card pool, there's more variety, at least in terms of what is possible. Of course, in terms of what is the best, maybe tier 1 would only be 3 decks, eventually Infinity, same as in Core Constructed. But in terms of like the tier 2, there's a much bigger tier 2 in Infinity, I think, than in Core Constructed in general. And so I like this aspect of Infinity, that there's more possibilities available. Okay, next up, let's talk about play-draw disparity. I think it's an important thing to take note of in any Lorcana format, because especially in a game like Lorcana, where you can't interact on your opponent's turn, the amount of advantage going first has a big impact on whether a format feels balanced, whether it feels competitive, or whether it's down to luck of the draw. So if we look at the numbers for the most recent Core Constructed, on a per game basis, going first yields you on average across all decks a 3.8% advantage, whereas in Infinity, it's currently sitting at like 4.8, 4.9%. So clearly worse in Infinity than in Core. Now, by no means is 3.8% in Core good. I think that is slightly unhealthy, and I think that's just a feature of Lorcana that the game designers haven't really figured out how to crack. I think it'd be much better, of course, if it's 50-50, but if up to like 52% advantage going first, I think is totally healthy. 53.8 coming to 54, that's pushing it a little high. But in Infinity, going first having a 55% advantage across all decks regardless of matchup, I think that this is a pretty massive issue. And when you play Infinity, you can really feel the difference, especially when you are on the draw against a very assertive strategy like Steel Song, like any Diablo deck that gets the turn 2 Diablo shift. Just feels quite unwinnable sometimes, even against the latest deck, Ruby Steel actions. Them going first, and if they get the nut hand, is just completely unstoppable. So I guess that's kind of the downside to having a larger card pool in Infinity, with access to more powerful effects across the board. When you go first and you get to do your powerful thing first, too many of the games just feel very unwinnable and feel too disgusting. So that's kind of a knock on Infinity, and I don't think this is necessarily going to change moving forward. So it is what it is. Okay, next up, let's talk about gameplay balance. So now I know what everyone's thinking about. Dogs is so busted, let's ban some cards from dogs, right? To be honest, regardless Infinity or Core, people are going to be shouting and screaming that anyway. If we look at the DLC Indianapolis numbers, dogs did dominate the top cut going into day 2. And from what I'm hearing that's going on in DLC Manila right now, right this second, it looks like dogs is going to be doing very well in Manila as well. So, full disclosure, I did get into a very long YouTube thread argument about this a couple of months back, and with 2 months worth of additional play, and with my experience at DLC Manila, though by the way I played against 0 dogs decks, still didn't make it through anyway. Through my testing, I've come to the conclusion that I think that the best deck in the format is the Kida Under the Sea version of dogs. The deck has no clear natural predator that it suffers, like 60-40 against. It's at least 50-50 into everything, if not better. It's probably advantage like 55% against the field. And so I think if nothing changes in like the next 3 to 4 sets, whenever the next Infinity season rolls around, we might need to start looking at bans. Specifically, I'm thinking of either Aurora, but more probably Eleanor, because I think Eleanor just pushes dogs way over the edge. The deck has just way too much value, such that even if you're able to deal with the initial onslaught, and you get your board wiped with Kida Under the Sea, and you still rebuild back, and you get to clear them, they still have enough gas because of the Eleanors and the Lady Fives and the Lilos in their discard to power through and win the game from there. So consider my opinion changed. I think this is something we have to look at. Next question, is the gameplay in Infinity interesting? And relatedly, will it become stale? And I think the answer to this general query is kind of complicated, right? Because to me personally, I think that if you play too much of a single format of Lorcana, it will always become stale. Because of the nature of the way the altar works, decks can quite consistently get to the game plan that they want to, both yourself and your opponent. And so, if you get into like 600 given games of a certain format, you basically kind of see all there is to see. And then it starts to feel pretty boring. I think that's also definitely the case in Infinity, and the feeling of staleness is amplified. Firstly, structurally, because the cards are more powerful, and so when you lose to something, or when you win with doing something busted, it feels more and more repetitive because it's either very disgusting for yourself to suffer through it, or for your game to quickly end because you feel you've just done the busted thing over and over and over and over again. So the powerful nature of it makes the games just feel more gross, which kind of gets you to the point of it feeling staler with lesser games. The second factor is, as mentioned in the previous question, the best deck, most busted deck is probably Dogs, which has also been the most busted deck in Core Constructor for a while. So people feel even doubly more disgusted by the way things have played out in Infinity, because it feels like a repetition of Core Constructed again, albeit they have more tools in Infinity to deal with Dogs. But that's kind of like a temporary thing, hopefully, because once the cards in Core Constructed rotate out, in Core will have a different menace, and maybe Dogs will remain the menace it is in Infinity, but then it will just be like a once every year thing. So overall, I think if we were to play Infinity year round, it will be stale very, very quickly because of the high power level, and people will quit the game. That's probably why they created Core Constructed. And so I think it's for this reason good that we have Infinity as a alternative to Core Constructed that can also feel stale, because once things gets really, really boring, we have the option to switch over to Infinity, experience something a bit different, and once this gets stale, we can go back to Core Constructed. So yeah, overall, good thing to have Infinity, even though gameplay can get a little boring with many, many repetitions because of the high power level of cards and the way Lorcana is just built. So, lastly, let's talk about scheduling and support from Ravensburger. So, on scheduling, I think Ravensburger did a great choice by picking this time to do a set of Infinity DLCs. The Just before the arrival of the new set that would herald the rotation of Core Constructed. It's at this time the interest in Core Constructed is the least, because people are actually really looking forward to a big shakeup with 4 sets rotating out and 1 new set rotating in. And so, what better time in any part of the calendar than to do Infinity here, right? On the downside, there was basically no, as I mentioned earlier in the video, no support for stores to try and run Infinity. There was no special Infinity promo. The set championship format for, I believe, almost all shops, at least in Singapore, was still Core Constructed. And I think that's mandated by, or at least in Singapore, the distributor, which probably takes some direction from Ravensburger. So that's not good, right? Where the DLC season and the format that Ravensburger wants you to play is Infinity, but your support for your local scene is still in Core Constructed. And so what does that lead to? It leads to players not going for the DLCs, not being interested in being engaged in Infinity. So your grassroots support is not there. And if you were to just look at the YouTube space, what are all the YouTube kind of video makers talking about? During this Infinity season, they didn't spend that much time talking about Infinity because people just weren't that interested in Infinity videos. They wanted Core Constructed deck lists and the latest tech to help them in their set championships, because that's the competitive endeavor that most of the player base is working towards. So having this disconnect between DLC and local league play and set championships is just not great. It's also weird that they did Infinity Weekend at a time way before this season. Thought it made sense as a starter to get people interested in Infinity, but it only makes sense to do it kind of like 6 months before the Infinity season if you're also going to do Infinity things at the grassroots level during the Infinity season, which did not materialize. So I think where they can improve from a support perspective is to have an event during the Infinity season akin to a set championships, but specifically for Infinity. If they gave out a special foil promo of a card that's only playable in Infinity, I don't know, like, and then along came Zeus, maybe like, Tram 7 moving forward, something like that, to at least get the grassroots level, league level players interested in Infinity, so that you can capture them to try and move them into the DLC scene in Infinity as well. So on the support front, I think ultimately bad from Ravensburger. So overall, was this Infinity season a success or a failure? I think it's a very difficult question to answer. Firstly, deciding to have this format at all is, of course, a success. Full points to them. Having a reasonably high number of DLCs, pretty much one for each region to support the format, grand success. The format being what it is, just no matter what the format is, having at least something different to play from Core Constructed is always good. So good choice from them. In terms of the gameplay, I've enjoyed it not just because it is a breath of fresh air, but because very different styles of decks are viable compared to in Core Constructed, and more decks within the format as well are viable. There's just more space to explore and play around with, even if it may not necessarily reflect in the tournament standings at the end of the day. In terms of support, though, at the grassroots level, I think abject failure. I think that's kind of shown itself in the play participation numbers as well. They just haven't done enough to support Infinity as well as they can. So on that front, it's like kind of like if you go A to F scale, overall, I would say taking into account every decision Ravensburgers made on Infinity, I think this first season is probably like a C plus. Passable, with the play participation numbers from DLC being the report card, it's clearly nowhere near as popular as Core Constructed. As I said, like 60 to 70% of the most enfranchised players in the game turning up for your event. Not to mention the lack of interest in it at the local scene level, generally speaking. Yeah, I think C plus is a fair result. But hey, overall, it's only upward trajectory from here, right? In terms of getting things right by promoting it more. I hope they see this first go at it as the DLCs as a sign that there is a lot of potential and room for the game to grow in this space. I hope they persevere and keep going at it rather than abandoning it and completely, you know, throwing it out and not having any DLC support moving forward. Because I think it's good for Lorcana to have variety in terms of formats. So yeah, overall, C+. Regardless, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've enjoyed this very expensive background. And if you have any thoughts on anything that I said, feel free to comment below. As always, like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one whenever I see you. Cheers!